welcome to We Never Met, the podcast where I have interesting strangers on every single week. Today we have Madison Olsen. How are you?
Good. Happy to be here.
Yeah, so you make a pretty amazing stained glass art, which is how I got introduced to you. I think I was just looking up stained glass artwork. And is this a relatively new thing for you, or is this something you've been doing for a while?
I started in stained glass in February of 2020. So it's been a little bit of time under my belt, but I'm still learning as I go.
Yeah, it's an amazing art form. I had another stained glass artist on here as well, who actually follows you. I think she's from Wisconsin, but it's such like I feel like the designs are so intricate sometimes that people forget that you're working with glass, and it's like such a hard medium to work with. So what got you interested in doing it in the first place? And was it a tough learning curve at the beginning?
Well, in the beginning, I had followed a couple of stained glass artists on Instagram for a couple of years. My interest in it peaked when I studied abroad in Bristol, the UK. Mm-hmm. When you go around there, you see a lot more stained glass because it is such an ancient art form. And visiting the cathedrals and the holy campuses and, going out to all of these intricate architectural spaces, like the stained glass that you see in there is incredible, unimaginable. I mean, if you think the stuff I make is detailed, that's just on another level. And so being able to see those windows and the way that stories were told, and religious stories specifically in that context, but seeing the way that stories were told in glass was such a unique mode of storytelling. And there's so much history there that I was inspired by it. And when I returned back to the United States, I noticed that there was a local stained glass class, and I thought that would be the perfect opportunity for me to introduce myself to the medium, see if it was for me. And I've always loved trying new art forms. I will try anything once. And I've dabbled with a lot of things before.
Sure. Stained
glass was just something I connected with right off the bat, and I decided to stick with it.
How long were you in Bristol for? How long did you study abroad over there?
I was there for an academic year, so about 9 months. Yeah. And I did that the year before the pandemic hit. And so it was kind of this perfect sweet spot in time for me.
Right.
Where, I was a student and I didn't have much responsibility in my life at the time, aside from my studies, and the world was just a lot lighter back then. So
yeah, because I studied abroad as well in Ireland, but I was there for 6 months. Was that your first trip over to Europe and being in that area?
Yeah, I traveled to Costa Rica previously, but other than that, my travels have mostly been in the United States.
Sure.
So it was just a huge, shock-inducing experience going to Europe, because I'd heard so much about it, seen it in the movies, but you can't really prepare yourself for the culture shock,
Yeah. Which is weird. It is very interesting because you sort of think of it as oh, well, they speak English as well, so it won't be that different. And then you go over there and you're like, well, it's pretty different than
yeah.
Here.
Yeah. I had that misconception too, but as soon as I got over there, I realized there is this shared reality that we have, and we're lucky that there isn't a communication barrier, because it made it so much easier to immerse myself and learn from the culture. But it was different enough that I was constantly learning new things every day.
Yeah. So did you get to travel around Europe a lot? Did you have a favorite spot that you got to visit or see?
I really liked France. My best friend was studying in France at the same time, so I got to spend quite a bit of time out there. And some of the other trips I did were a little shorter, but since I had a place to stay in France, I was able to go out there for a couple weeks and really get to know the place. So maybe I'm biased because I spent the most time there, but
sure. Yeah. Because I agree. I went to Nice in France, and that was my favorite place. The south of France was just if I had a lot of money, I would definitely move here.
Right. Yeah. I visited Lyon and Paris.
Okay. Yeah. But it was really cool. So before you went to study abroad, did you have a different sort of thought as far as your life trajectory? Were you in a different spot than when you came back? Did that experience impact you heavily?
Well, it definitely made me want to move back. So that kind of changed things for me.
Sure.
I went out there in the middle of my education. So when I came back, I was still very tunnel vision about finishing my degrees.
Hmm.
And, I try not to limit myself to certain future trajectories. I try to keep it open, and like
Hmm.
I do the things that I enjoy and the things that I think I'm skilled at. And like I find that the opportunities fall into place if I'm in line with my goals. And so, and that's kind of how the whole study abroad trip came into fruition anyways. I was able to get a full ride scholarship and my school paid for the whole trip. And it was just this really serendipitous thing. When I came back, I was still incentivized to continue with modeling and styling, but getting into stained glass like changed my whole trajectory. Like I
Mm.
couldn't have possibly foreseen the impact that it would have on my life at the time, because this was all before I had tried
Sure.
it. And
Yeah.
so it's like now to think that I'm working in a creative field and I'm trying to cultivate my own small business, it's kind of a crazy jump from that student oriented mindset that I was in when I first returned.
Right. So has that always been an active mindset that you had, like, or have you had to work to get to that point of like not stressing out so much about like where you need to go or where you should be going, but just like enjoying what you're doing currently and just seeing where the chips fall?
I definitely struggle when I feel that I don't have control over the future, because
Mm.
the thing about my approach to the future is that I know like no matter what I end up doing, I will be able to control my circumstances and have
Mm.
autonomy over my own being.
Sure.
And so with COVID and everything, the lack of control has been really hard. But in general, I've already done so much more than I expected for myself
Mm.
that everything I do just feels like a blessing.
Sure. I mean, that's a good mindset to have. So we're talking about like the stained glass stuff and getting into that more and more. How did you go about like the style that you wanted to, or path you wanted to go down with the style? Did it seem like you had a similar style to the other art forms that you were doing at the time, or was this sort of like a breaking away from all of that and sort of trying to find your own style within stained glass?
Well, in all of the art that I do, I heavily focus on color schemes and the selection of the elements that are used in the piece in order to evoke a dynamic mood as opposed to a static image.
Mm.
So I use color schemes and palettes and like composition to tell a story almost in one
Mm.
image. And it is kind of hard to have a visual essay in one image because it is just one single frame, like a single
Sure.
moment captured in time. And so the elements of the scene, if it's for a photography shoot, the styling, the
Hmm.
location, the people who are involved, like working off of what they bring to the table.
Mm.
With stained glass, it's more like using the space to, fill the space to tell a story, to create a dynamic.
Do you find it more difficult because there's less, I guess not less leeway, but like there's less elements to, like you talked about, the location and the people and like the styling and all of that when you're doing like photography, even though it's a single frame, there's a lot more elements to sort of move around and like work off of when you're doing that, as opposed to like stained glass where it's sort of you and glass. Like
Yeah.
so is it more difficult than in that art form, or did you find it more difficult to like weave a story in there or like work a story in there because there's less elements to manipulate, I guess?
Well, I almost find real life to be more limiting in that respect, because you have
Mm.
to work off of the mundane. You have to
Mm.
work off of the reality. It's like when you're drawing up you're drawing up a pattern for stained glass, like you can use whatever your mind can think of.
Mm.
You can use the spiritual elements. You can use the sky, you can use
Yeah.
nature, you can use humans, you can use all these things. With photography, you're kind of more limited by what's in front of you.
Do you draw and like paint as well? Because I always found that when I talked to the other artist who is Silk Noel, who follows you, actually, she's a stained glass artist. She also draws as well, because there seems to be a big crossover between like, how you're going to work a stained glass piece and like the sort of pre-production part of like what I want to do with this piece before you start cutting glass and all of that. So do you also like draw and paint as well?
Yeah, so that is the background side that a lot of people don't see. I think with the Instagram culture, people oftentimes like they see the end product of something.
Hmm.
They see after all the work is done, they don't see the work that's contained in it.
Hmm.
And I think that with a background in drawing, because that is my initial background was pen and ink drawing, I think that that's been something that really sets my work apart is my distinctive drawing style,
Hmm.
because the design is the foundation for the whole piece. It's your blueprint that you work off of from start to finish. And so it is one of the most important steps in the process. And with something like stained glass, each step in the process is like its own individual art form. With designing and the way that you have to design with stained glass, there are like limitations to what can be done. And so you have to kind of work around those design limitations in order to actualize your vision.
Mm.
And so, yeah, I found that having a background in design really helps. And almost the issue I ran into when I first got into stained glass was that I had these designs in my head, but I didn't have the skill level to execute the level of detail that I wanted, or just the level of attention to little things in the
Mm.
piece. It was more, I had to create more rudimentary designs at first to like,
Sure.
before I caught up with my own skills.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. There is always that gap when people start. I forget the exact word for it, but it's like basically like your taste does not meet up with your skill level yet at the beginning of when you're doing it. Have you always been drawing? Is that always something that you'd like to do even as a kid?
Yeah, I mean, for as long as I can remember, art has provided an outlet for me to control my existence and have that autonomy in my life. And that was first achieved through detail oriented pen and ink drawings. And I felt like that was a way for me, like that was a form of documentation for me almost, like
Mm.
an insight into my mind, an idea translated to paper that could kind of give insight into how I was feeling during that time.
Mm.
I almost saw it as like revealing as much about me as a novel does about its writer.
Mm.
It's more, but it's through the visual story, right?
Were your parents and like family very supportive of that, like of going sort of down your artistic journey that you have gone?
My mom fostered my creativity from a really young age, and she was always trying to get me into classes and let me experiment with new mediums. And I was always really close with my art teachers growing up and have had very like special apprenticeship dynamics and have people wanting to foster that creative mind. And that's really special because in a lot of communities, people aren't encouraged to pursue art. It's not a valued societal thing.
Mm.
Yeah, I've gotten a lot of support from my family and friends. There's definitely been pushback too from other
Sure.
people, but I think that that's kind of natural when you're trying to push in a creative field because a lot of people just don't see the value of artists in society. People like to consume art, they like to view it, they like to have the aesthetic experience that it invokes. But then when it comes to actually like the person in your life that wants to be an artist, sometimes people just don't see that potential until you actually do it. And
Sure.
so since it has been working out, a lot of those people who were giving pushback initially have come to accept it.
Right. Yeah. Because I forgot to ask you this, but where are you from? Where did you grow up?
I grew up in a small old town in the Wild West, Ogden, Utah. Yeah, it's
I'm not
very
sure where that is. Where is that, Ogden, Utah?
it's up north in
Oh,
Utah.
it's by
So
Salt Lake, sort of, right?
yeah,
Okay.
yeah, it's just north of Salt Lake. It's very middle America imagery, but imagine that surrounded by looming mountains in all directions.
Yeah. No, it's beautiful. Like you must have grown up with just beautiful scenery around you.
Yeah, and that really fostered a love of nature from a young age. My mom's super into hiking, backpacking, river rafting. So she was always pushing for those activities. And I'm still really inspired by nature in my art. So
Mm.
that made a long lasting impact for me.
Were you river rafting as a kid? Did your mom take you river rafting as a young kid?
Oh yeah, we love whitewater river rafting.
How young were you the first time you went, probably?
The first time I went, I was probably like 12.
That's pretty young.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we don't go on the dangerous rapids as much.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, because I went as an adult, and it was a wild ride as an adult. So I can't imagine a 12-year-old trying to like hang on while you're just going down the rapids.
Oh yeah. We go to the Snake River every year usually.
Okay, it's a good recommendation. Is that like a popular whitewater rafting place? or river
Yeah,
rafting?
yeah, and you can get camping spots right along the river. And we actually did a backpacking trip there too during the solar eclipse. I don't know if you
Oh,
remember that. We hiked up to a vantage point where you could have a full 360-degree view of the
wow.
eclipse, and yeah, it was absolutely beautiful, full visibility.
Did
Highly
you have
recommend it.
did you have to have the you can't look at eclipse, right? You have to like sort of look
Yeah.
away or something.
No, disclaimer, don't look at the sun.
Especially in eclipse, I heard it can like really hurt your eyes.
Oh yeah, that will fry your eyes for sure.
Yeah. So do you have to have like do you have special viewing glasses or like how do you even see it? Like how do you even look at it?
Yeah, they kind of remind me of the old 3D glasses that you would get at the movie theater.
Okay. So what made you move to Oregon? Like why'd you come out here?
Well, I was raised by a single mother, and then when I was in my teens, I actually got into contact with my father, and I decided when I was 16 to take a chance and move out here with him.
Mm,
And so I pretty much just uprooted my whole life, but it was something I was really eager to do. And I moved here my senior year of high school and finished out school here before going to UO. I always knew that I wanted to leave my hometown. You know,
mm,
as much as it was difficult to leave my family and my comfort zone, from a young age, I always had notions of a grandiose life. You know, I wanted to
mm,
move to a cool city. I wanted to move to somewhere where art was considered essential. I wanted to
mm,
move somewhere where I could feel a sense of belonging because I
mm.
was always a bit of an oddball in that little old town, you know?
Sure.
So it was a shot in the dark, but it was probably the best decision I've ever made.
Did you learn? Can you remember back to that point of like, it has to be scary. I mean, especially in high school, finishing your last year at a completely different high school, that's tough, you know, I would imagine. Did you learn anything, or was there any change in who you were from that year where you moved from a place that you completely basically knew like the back of your hand with your eyes closed to a completely new environment to finish out like your last year of school? What did you learn about yourself?
Well, I kind of learned that I might be addicted to the feeling of starting over. I do. I definitely, I love the feeling of just leaving behind the aspects that you don't want to have anymore, the aspects of
Mm,
yourself that you don't want, that aren't serving you.
sure.
Um, and moving here, I was able to leave behind some of those aspects of myself that I felt were no longer serving me. And some of the mentalities that I'd brought from a small town, you know, and a
Mm,
very like religiously oriented small town. Like I personally was not raised religious, but a lot of the ideologies from growing up in that region of the United States had still
yeah.
influenced my lens of viewing the world.
Mm,
And so I found that I was able to gain a more broad societal perspective. And
mm,
Portland's a very progressive place. And so I was able to like learn a lot more discourse about structural issues and the things that need to be improved in society and just a lot of things I wasn't exposed to in that small town bubble, if
yeah.
that makes sense.
No, it makes sense completely. I didn't grow up necessarily in the exact same situation, but I grew up in a town outside of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and it was a bubble. Yeah, like you don't really see the outside world as much. You don't really. Yeah, I think going to college for me was a big change of that. But no, I completely get where you're coming from. And sometimes you just gotta like literally move like to get a new perspective and to sort of challenge yourself and become a better person, at least what I found.
Yeah, and then that feeling was kind of taken a step further when I did have the opportunity to go to England
Mm,
because like I was able to kind of further dissect these identities of myself that had become a given and like the like identity of being American and like what that means, the global implications of that, how that influences how I interact with the spaces I'm in, and how the way that people treated me abroad changed when I did adapt the way I interacted with those spaces. Like,
mm,
because by the time I was completing my study abroad trip, I had acquired a lot more cultural norms of being in
mm.
England and the way that people were treating me was subsequently changing. And so it goes to show like the cause and effect of how your identity influences the way that people perceive and treat you. And then it just reinforces that.
But yeah, I was going to ask too about, so there was a massive, this is completely off topic, but there was a massive piece that you did that I saw on your Instagram of stained glass, like so big. Who was that for specifically? It was for a business, right?
Yeah, so that was for St. Perpetua Patio. It's a little restaurant that's opening up on the coast of Oregon.
Mm,
They're not open yet, but they're preparing to sometime this year, and it's going to be really exciting.
nice. How long did that piece, like for perspective of people that are listening, how big was that piece?
So this piece was about 4.5 by 3 feet. So the size of a small child.
Yeah, yeah, it's big.
um, and yeah, it took quite a long time. At the time that I was working on this piece, my studio setup was a lot more rudimentary than it is now. I've managed to build my setup a lot more, and so I wasn't working with the same convenience and tools that I have now. But I
Mm,
do believe that working with rudimentary tools is a good way to build your skill and challenge yourself. Though having good tools has definitely saved my hands a lot
yeah, I
of
bet.
cuts.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's like at the time I wasn't viewing my limitations as a barrier for creating large ideas.
Hmm.
It was definitely, as I was getting into it, I was like, did I bite off more than I could chew? But with
Sure.
the way that it came out, I'm glad that I challenged myself because it was a very long process from start to finish, probably about a couple months.
Wow. Because
Hmm.
how did you? I don't know if you counted, but how many individual pieces are there in that massive piece? Because it looked like there was tons.
Oh yeah, there are 100. There were probably like 250 pieces if I remember correctly.
Wow. Yeah.
And yeah, and then with font work, it's very detailed too because you have to design it in a particular way that can incorporate a lot of little pieces of glass sometimes because you
Sure.
can't with stained glass design you can't really get inverted curvature, so you have to separate everything by solder lines. It's kind of hard to
Mm,
explain, but designing it was one of the most challenging parts. I like to work really closely with clients when I'm designing stuff, depending on the piece and obviously the vibe of the commission. But with these people, I could tell that this was a very like meaningful thing for them, and it was going to be a primary piece of branding for their
mm,
store or for their restaurant front. And so I started off with creating a mood board that was informed by their input, so it would have color schemes, like type of fonts that they like, the type of like era and vibe that they're looking for. Like they
mhm.
were really inspired by like French tattoo shops and Art Deco. And so and then, compiling images. People have very interesting sources of inspiration, like whether it
Mhm.
be a song or like, whether it be people will send me pictures of the room they're going to put the piece in and say
Mhm.
design around the room. It just depends on the person. But so I created a mood board, and then based on that, I started drafting the design, which creating something, you have to create a thumbnail that you'll then enlarge.
Mm,
So you have to make sure that your design will translate into the larger template.
sure.
Because the design was so big, I had to actually get custom templates printed out at a print shop, a
Oh
local print
wow.
shop. Yeah. So, yeah. So you then, cut out the design, paste it on the glass. Oh, I have to order the right supplies to wait for all of those to arrive. Glass selection is tough.
Yeah. There's got to be a lot to choose from.
Yeah, you can go down a rabbit hole.
Yeah, I bet.
And sourcing glass, there's so many different places to get it, but there are so few places where you can walk in and look at it and really
Mm,
take in the essence. And it's so hard to capture photos of glass. It's something I still struggle with.
yeah.
And I spend so much time on the product photography.
Right.
So it's like usually you're seeing a picture of this glass online and it arrives and it's like expectation versus reality,
Sure.
you
Sure.
know?
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
So I ended up having to make a few last minute design changes based on the way that the glass looked in person that I had ordered. But when it was finally done, they were so pleased with it that it made all the challenges worth it. It always does.
Yeah.
Seeing the piece come to life, seeing it in the light for the first time, because a lot of the time you're just working with it on the table you don't see the essence of it until you see it with the sunbeams coming through and the way that it reflects on other surfaces and how dynamic it is, the way that light moves through it. It's like you just never see that in photos, but that's why the customers are lucky, because they get to take in the full beauty of it, you know?
We talked about this a little bit, but you going to school, like your degree is very different than what you're doing now, right? I think was it in sociology? Is that correct? Or psychology or something along those lines?
Yeah, I have a double major in psychology and sociology.
And were you going to intend to was the intention to sort of be a therapist or something in that realm, or was it just interesting subjects to you in school?
When I was setting out for my degree, I was interested in a career path that, you know, involved being a pillar of strength and support for my community. Just because of the dynamics that I do have with my friends, I found that people feel comfortable opening up to me about their inner worlds, and I love giving advice, and I love the feeling of being able to help. But also, as I've gone on in the arts, I've kind of learned that art can have some of those therapeutic applications as well, which is why the role of artists in society is so important, because, you know, art therapy is a thing. And also like the therapeutic benefits of working on art itself and getting into a meditational flow state and like feeling the sense of achievement that comes from completing something from start to finish. Yeah. There are like so many benefits to consuming and creating art too. And so as I started to go on, I kind of saw the cornerstone of where art and society meet. And I feel like they're not unrelated things, you know? My degrees have helped me understand and connect with my art better, if anything. And they're also just applicable to everyday life, you know, learning about humans, working with humans, like we're constantly going to be applying that information. I am fascinated by human nature and social structures and how they influence our day-to-day lives. And I think that my art kind of reflects the relationship between humans and society as well. I don't necessarily see myself thriving in an office setting right now. I've enjoyed working in this creative field, and I've enjoyed seeing the way that also helps people.
Where can people find your work and reach out to you and look at your amazing stained glass stuff? Where can people find that?
Oh, thank you so much. I appreciate those kinds words. You can find me on Instagram. My Instagram is at mysteriesglass, mysterys.glass. And then you can also find me on Etsy. And my Etsy is also Mysteries Glass with no space.
Awesome.
I'm working to get a website set up, but that's not in fruition yet.
Cool. Yeah, thank you so much. Definitely go follow those accounts. And yeah, just thank you so much for your time. It was awesome chatting with you.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate the opportunity to speak on this platform, and hopefully, you know, my work can get out there to some new places because of it.